Hi everyone, Peter here from Movement and Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering the question, how often should you train? And more specifically, we're going to be covering the sort of general principles and theories surrounding training frequency and how we can best apply these in our programming so that we can optimize our athletic performance. So the first thing we need to understand, and the most important concept we need to understand, is that training frequency is not so much of an issue as total weekly training volume is. So we can have the same total training volume and split it over 3 days, and we can do the same thing. We can have the same volume and split it over 4 days, and really the effects are going to be not much different. But the effects that will be different, we're going to get into in the future slides. So just looking at this picture here, just to visually represent that, this is our total weekly volume, just a theoretical number. And so we have Monday to Sunday, so the days of the week. And let's say we distribute the volume a certain way by having 30% of it on Monday, 20% on Wednesday, and then 25% on Friday. So they're sort of our main training days. And then we might have some light training days on Thursday and Saturday. And then on Tuesday and Sunday are off days, so there's no actual training involved. But we can sort of split them up however we want, but we're going to get into what sort of is going to be optimal. So the most important factor, we've got to establish our weekly training volume. And this is a very arbitrary number and very difficult to quantify because how much training volume we do is dependent on what qualities we're training, what training phase we're in, are we doing sport-specific training as well, what is our sport, the athlete's age, the athlete's training age. There's so many factors that go into this, but essentially you need to understand that there is some theoretical total volume that if you exceed, you will not actually recover and adapt positively to. And it's also important to understand that this value or this theoretical value changes over time, again, depending on the context, the athlete, all that sort of stuff. And the best way to really find out how much volume we can handle at any given time is trial and error and experience. So athletes who have been training for a long time will sort of have quite a general idea, a good general idea of how much they can train before they actually run into issues. A really good resource if you want to go more into detail about how much training volume you should do is a book called How Much Should I Train by Renaissance Periodization, which you can find on their website. And it basically covers the volume landmarks of our training related to all different sports and concepts, but the general principles are exactly the same for all sports. So it's a really good resource to understand the principles. And then, yeah, obviously our total training volume can be split into as many training sessions as we want, and we can distribute them however we want. But ideally, we sort of want to separate them. Our main main high volume training days, we need to separate them by sort of throughout the week as opposed to having them all clumped together. Otherwise, we might lower the quality of those training sessions. So moving on, we're going to talk about sort of the different qualities of training and sort of how this influences our training frequency. So you can check out a video on this channel called How long does it take to recover from training? And essentially that's going to go into sort of the recovery and adaptive time lengths of sort of different qualities of strength and conditioning training. So we're just going to talk a little, sort of briefly touch on that and sort of get an understanding of how intensive things are and how long they take to recover from, and therefore how frequently we can train them. So things like maximal speed, top end speed, max power training, maximal strength training, they're very central nervous system intensive. They fatigue our central nervous system a lot, and therefore, because our central nervous system takes longer to recover, our recovery times for these exercises are longer, so our frequency is probably going to be lower. In terms of things like hypertrophy training, the underlying mechanisms of hypertrophy and how we actually adapt, it generally requires somewhere between 24 and 72 hours, sometimes longer if they're very advanced athletes, to recover and adapt and have hypertrophic adaptations. So the training frequency is going to be slightly different for those qualities. In terms of conditioning, it's very non-intensive, and it doesn't tax the central nervous system as much as higher intensity training. However, it can be quite structurally taxing on certain joints if we're repeatedly loading them for hours and hours. But usually we don't really need more than 2 to 3 times per week unless we're specifically endurance athletes. Most team sport athletes don't need more than this per week to actually adapt and get the benefits they require. And then the last thing is technique, which has the quickest recovery time of all the qualities. So our technique, we can pretty much perform at the highest frequency, because the higher the frequency, the more skill practice it is, and because it's so non-intensive on our bodily systems, we can just continue to pretty much do technique training every day. So getting into the sort of some general training frequency recommendations. So those high intensity, highly central nervous system intensive activities like maximal speed, max power, and max strength, we want a lower frequency, so between 1 and 3 really hard sessions per week. Hypertrophy training, we want a sort of maybe a more moderate frequency, so 2 to 4 times per week per body part, so depending on the body parts we're training. Smaller type body parts, such as abs, biceps, maybe deltoids, things like that, can sort of have a higher training frequency because they can't be damaged as much, whereas things like bigger muscle groups like the hamstrings, quadriceps, chest, and back, they might only, we might need to sort of drop the frequency to around 2 times per week. In terms of conditioning, probably a moderate frequency, and this is going to be highly dependent on the individual athlete. For athletes don't actually need too much conditioning, 1 or 2 sessions per week might be enough. More endurance type athletes might need 4+ sessions per week. So technique work, again, highest frequency, 3 to 10+ times per week. And we're in 10+ because you can actually do technique work more than once per day. So you hear of sort of weightlifters who, or gymnasts who train multiple times a day just because the skill requirements of some sports are so high that the training frequency required to actually really hone in those technique qualities is going to be a lot. It's going to be really high frequency. And a good thing here to understand is that not all qualities can be emphasized at all times. So we can't do the upper end of these frequencies for all qualities at all times. If we're emphasizing, let's say, maximal strength, we're not going to train maximal strength 3 times per week and then also do conditioning 4 times per week and do hypertrophy training as well 4 times per week. We will simply exceed our recoverable weekly volumes that we talked about at the start. So some practical ways that I can sort of emphasize this point is that if we have, this is an example weekly plan, and the emphasis here is more strength and hypertrophy with a little bit of sort of power and speed on the back burner. So as we can see, Monday we have, this is 4 days per week, by the way, this split. So we have sled pull, which is going to be less intensive than maximal speed training, power clean, back squat, push, press, and a plank, stiff leg deadlift, pull-ups, back extension, aerobic conditioning on that day as well, etc., etc. You can read the rest, but essentially there's sort of a moderate frequency for all variables. Strength training, we're splitting up the body parts and the movements so that we're sort of hitting similar movements and body parts only about twice per week. We're only doing conditioning twice per week. Pretty much everything here is twice per week. So it's sort of on the sort of lower to moderate end of these sort of recommendations, but it's still we're going to be able to make progress. In this phase, for example, this could be a speed and power emphasis, this training block. So this is going to have, we're going to have flying sprints, drop jumps, so quite intensive work, but we're only going to be doing them maybe twice per week. And a good thing I want you to understand in this block is that we're doing some sort of speed work every day. So flying sprints, wickets, long sprints, and block starts. But if we do maximal speed training 4 times per week, and we're probably going to run into some issues. So what I've done here is our flying sprints and our long sprints are going to be the most intensive on our system. So they're going to be the most taxing, so you separate them. And then between that, we have more skill work. So short block starts are not going to be that taxing, and wicket drills are more of a technique drill. So we're still working on the technique between these more intensive speed sessions. And same thing with our power type training. So a drop jump and plyometric bounds are going to be really taxing on us, but things like maybe lighter power snatches and medicine ball throws are not going to be as taxing, so we can sort of intersperse them between our really intensive sessions. So that's it for this presentation, guys. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of it. If you feel like you want to learn more, you can follow Movement and Performance on Facebook and on Instagram. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel. So if you're a curious individual that's interested in learning more about sports performance, then on Facebook and Instagram you can find these sort of research infographics, which is basically the latest research, and they're summarized into these sort of easy to understand graphics, so that you can stay up to date with the latest research in sports performance training. So thanks for watching, guys, and hopefully you got something out of this video.